Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. And everybody should be muted. If you would like to ask questions towards the end of the talk, we can use the chat window for that. So thank you for joining us for the first Visiting Artists, Designers, and Scholars lecture of the spring 2022 semester, sponsored by the School of Art. I'm Heidi Jensen, Associate Professor of Art at Ball State. And first, we want to acknowledge that the region that Ball State University currently occupies is the ancestral homeland of Indigenous Americans, including the Miami people, many of whom were first to move in 1846 to what is now Kansas and later Oklahoma by the US government. The Delaware people have also considered this region their home after having been displaced from their ancestral homelands in what is now New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and before they too were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. Today, Indigenous people from many different nations live in Muncie and Delaware County and work and study at Ball State. This talk is in conjunction with the current exhibition in the Ned and Gloria Griner Art Gallery, Rajada, the works of David Cuatlacuatl. And I'm just going to let a few more people into our waiting room here. Okay. So to tell you a little bit about the work in the gallery and the artist, David Cuatlacuatl was a student in the School of Art at Ball State. He graduated in 2011 with a BFA in visual communication. David went on to earn an MFA from Penn State in 2015. In 2017, at the time of David's untimely passing, he held the position of arts coordinator at the Sofia Quintero Art and Cultural Center in Toledo, Ohio, and was co-director of the Riscache Art Residency in Puebla, Mexico. So with over 100 works spanning painting, drawing, and collage, the exhibition Rajada seeks to amplify contemporary urgencies within our Latinx migrant communities. I just lost my Word document here. This exhibition addresses transborder indigeneity, real lived migrant experiences, and the complexities of navigating migrant identities. So we're so glad to have David's work exhibited on the Ball State campus, and Rajada will be traveling to Penn State University next. With us today to talk about the exhibition is Federico Cuatlacuatl, David's brother, who has served as curator for this project. Federico earned his BFA in animation from Ball State in 2013 and went on to earn an MFA in digital arts from Bowling Green State University in 2015. Federico's own practice spans varied ways of making, and recent projects have included kites, traveling microcinema, murals, experimental documentary. His work is invested in disseminating topics of Latinx immigration, social art practice, and cultural sustainability. Federico is an assistant professor in the Department of Art at the University of Virginia, where he teaches new media, and he is also the director of the Riscache Artist Residency. So please join me in welcoming Federico back to Ball State. And Federico, I will turn the screen over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Heidi. It's such a pleasure. Of course, it'd be nicer to be in person with all you all at the School of Art at Ball State. But unfortunately, we had to reschedule this virtually because of the Omicron variant coming through. But I'm really happy to be sharing more about the artwork, about the exhibition. If you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition, I'll be sharing some images from the exhibition that is up until February 4th. So I hope if you're at Ball State or near Ball State, I hope you get a chance to see that. Thank you, Heidi, for the incredible support to make this happen. It means a lot for me, for my family. It has been quite an emotional journey to get here, the whole process, and it just feels really special to be back where David and I started as undergraduate students at Ball State and having grown up in Indiana. I'm currently in our hometown in Cholula, Puebla, Mexico, and so you might hear some of the daily life sounds around here, and it's even more special for me to be sharing about this work with you all from my hometown. I'll be sharing a lot of historical content that will give context to the work that David was producing, to the experiences that we have lived through. And hopefully it'll allow you to better understand how David was processing a lot of these experiences, a lot of these thoughts as he was developing his work. So it spans about 10 years since he arrived at Ball State, and then all the way through after he finished his MFA at Penn State. So let me go ahead and share my screen and get started with this exhibition, this presentation. Let's see here. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me just pull up my notes and then. Yeah, so David and I both were born in Cholula, Puebla, Mexico. And in 1999, we both migrated to the US and grew up in Plymouth, Indiana, a small town in northern Indiana. And I'll be sharing more of our migratory journey and how that informed and shaped his work. But a lot of this sort of childhood displacement really comes back and shapes the way that David was using materials, the way that he was exploring form as a painter, and how he was really pushing the dialogue or the discourse of painting within this kind of lens and perspective of this indigenous community child that then migrates to the US and is confronted with a completely different world. So this is one of the shots at the exhibition. And I wanted to start out with talking about the title itself and where that comes from and how that played a role in the curatorial part of the works, which there are about 100 works in this exhibition. But the Rajada translates to scarred feet, and this term has been historically used in Mexico and continues to be used as a term of discrimination, racism towards indigenous communities. And I did consult with my parents about this title when I was thinking about how to conceptually frame all of the work together. And I think one of the things that David and I have been doing is embracing and learning to really acknowledge and embrace our origins, right? Cholula, the community where we're from, is an original community, is what they call them here, or an indigenous community. And as I was talking to my parents about this title, inevitably, a lot of conversations came up about our grandparents and past generations growing up bare feet and going to school bare feet and working in the fields bare feet. And so this was a very real part to our narrative, right? To our experiences, to our intergenerational identities. And so I think there's something really powerful about embracing one's own narratives and even traumas, right? So that then we can start building agency or a sense of empowerment. And so for me, it actually becomes a really powerful gesture to embrace who we are, right? And especially because historically in Mexico, we've been forced to think of ourselves as being shameful if we are indigenous, right? To reject our own identities, to build this internalized racism within these communities. And so in a way, this is a very much a gesture of resistance and a decolonial gesture. and also a sense of pride and empowerment as we continue to look at our origins here in Mexico. And then the other thing that I did also with this exhibition is the curatorial part was to have walls carry a theme. And it actually happened kind of organically because I got to learn a lot more about David's way of thinking and how he was digesting all of this, all of these experiences in history. And so I found that a lot of the works were very much in conversation with one another on thematic topics. And each wall is labeled with a phrase or a word in Nahuatl, which is our original language here in our hometown. And this was also a gesture of resistance and self-preservation, and how do we approach the decolonization of white cube gallery spaces, right? Or gallery spaces in general. And for me, this was also really important to make sure that the curatorial part carried that across, right? And so I'll be going over each wall and how the works are in conversation with one another and some of the topics and thematics that they carry. I wanted to start out with some context, right? Some history that you will see how this has been shaping and informing David's work. And this is one of my favorites that he created during his MFA studies at Penn State University. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to locate this one. I haven't been able to find it, but I thought it would be a great way to start with some history and how that brings us to current times and how that has informed David's work. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrives in what is now called the Americas. He arrives without a visa and without a permit of entrance. In 1517, Francisco Hernandez de Cordova makes first contact with Mexico on the coast of Yucatan, also without a visa, without a passport, without a permit of entrance. In 1519, Hernán Cortés, Spanish conquistador, leads his way through Mexico. And one of the major stops is, as you can see from this map, is Cholula. This was one of the major cities before heading to Tenochtitlan, or what is now Mexico City. When he arrived in Cholula, we see the first massacre of colonization happen here in our home place. Here is a codex image of the massacre in Cholula. We just marked 500 years since this massacre in 2019, so only a few years ago. And there's still a lot of work being done here in uncovering and retelling these events more accurately. In 1523, we see this phenomena now called aperramiento, and this was taking Mesoamerican priests from Tenochtitlan and Cholula and killing them with dogs in front of the public. This would lead into what was called the other conquest, which was a religious conquest, right? A belief system, way of life, spirituality, and cosmology of indigenous communities here. During 1571 through the 1700s, we see the Mexican Inquisition arrive. The Catholic Inquisitions, they're called sometimes Holy Inquisitions or Saint Inquisitions, happened throughout various regions of the world where we saw Spanish colonization. And this was a Catholic agenda to aggressively and violently convert communities. And Mexico faced a pretty aggressive couple hundred years of this phenomena, where we saw execution of people, or torturing, and aggressive evangelization of indigenous communities. And of course, this would lead to a very intentional and systemic way of controlling politics, economy, culture, and building hierarchical power systems that are still in place today. So what you're seeing in this image here, this is only 10 minutes away from where I'm currently at. This is the sort of the matriarchal Catholic Church that was built. It was initially built in 1594, and then it was reconstructed in 1874. This is one of the largest pyramid structures in the world. As you can see from this image, this aggressive colonization of religion and spirituality was a very literal approach of erasing, hiding this part of our culture and history. And so then you could see a very intentional Catholic Church built on top of this. Slowly, some of the parts of the original structure have been uncovered. This is the finished church with the background there as a volcano. In 1980, the local mayor of Cholula, of this city, Ramon Blanca Garcia, declares the Cholula massacre a myth. This is what he said publicly in 1980. An exaggerated chronicle of a minor plague acquired by local Indians when some benevolent Spaniards passed through the city. This was only a few years ago that somebody in position of power here tried to erase that massacre. It hasn't been the only instance or moment when we've seen that here. There's been this crisis of a history that is dismembered, that was violently erased, broken, and bleeding, and in constant need of the repair, healing, and reconstructed in a more accurate way of how these events unfolded. In 1994, on January 1st of 1994, the indigenous communities in southern Mexico launched their uprising. On January 1st of the same year, in 1994, we see the NAFTA agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, the US, and Canada. The reason these communities in southern Mexico decided to launch their uprising on the same day that this international agreement was passed was very much a response to the way that globalization and these international agreements aggressively affect these rural communities to the point where the only thing that they were seeking were basic human rights, such as a better health system, education, and so during this same time, I see a lot of, looking back at migration from my hometown, we see a lot of migration happening during the early 90s and mid 90s into the 2000s. So in 1995, my father migrates to Indiana and leaves my brother and I and my mom behind. In 1996, my mom migrates and leaves my brother and myself behind. And this image is about the age that David and I were when we were left there until 1999, when we were smuggled into New York City. So from this town, we landed in New York City and then drove down to Indiana. I think a lot of this, that whole experience of being there without our parents and then migrating ourselves was a constant, it was a constant challenge for us to digest and to really work through that. And luckily, David was the first one to take a lead on creatively coping with all of these phenomena that was happening to us. And David was the first to really lean into creative ways that he could express these traumas, these emotions, and these experiences. And of course, because we were only like a year and a half apart, I would also follow his steps. And to this day, I feel like we were super lucky that both of us found this creative output to be able to digest and deal with these experiences. David and I both went to Ball State as undocumented immigrants. And this really also marked the way that we were processing even then the hardships and subsisting being an immigrant. And in 2013, DACA was passed under the Obama administration. So we luckily were able to get DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals. This would allow us to actually pursue a master's program. Before that, there was just no realistic way to move forward to higher education without any kind of status, right? So I wanted to start out with this image from the exhibition because it's one of the most special, one of the most sort of intimate ones that David was looking back at these experiences of arriving in the US and sort of trying to recollect those memories, those feelings, and how that was informing the way that he was expressing our collective journey through this. I must also mention that David was the first person from our hometown here in Mexico to enroll in a university in the US. This really marked our ambition as artists, right? This really also marked his work ethic to pave that path, right? That was not there yet. This really meant a whole sacrifice from himself, but also from our family, right? So this became an intergenerational experience for David to actually start his education at Ball State University. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is the title of this talk, Nothing Ever Translates Well, was actually one of the titles that David wrote a paper on during his MFA studies. And a lot of what that you will see in his work is trying to tell you these experiences that he was going through, that we were going through. And inevitably, so much gets lost in translation, right? Inevitably, it's almost impossible to rebuild those experiences so that you can better empathize and have a deeper understanding of what he was going through and what he perceived our communities going through. And so I think nothing ever translates well refers to this constant recollection of memories and traumatic experiences and trying to translate that into this visual language that carries narrative, that carries these real lived experiences, that carries this ongoing endurance of traumas and history that we have to carry when we cross that border. And so I think there was an endeavor here from David to build some empathy, right, and a better understanding of migrant indigenous experiences through his work. And at the same time, there was a lot of, you will notice that even with this image here, there's a lot of notions of assimilation, homogenization, rerouting oneself, the process of being whitewashed, this process of being forced to reinterpret oneself constantly because you are in a new world where you have to reinterpret yourself, reconstruct yourself. How do you translate all of those experiences? And so at some point, we were also recognizing that we, in a way, were becoming homeless because too many homes reside within us, right? And so David was really addressing this mobility and rootedness and what that meant for us who really value land and our home. And you will see that in one of the themed walls, that kind of value that we hold to being rooted. So back to this painting that is in one of the first walls that I'm going to be talking to you about, this one right here. The painting in the center, it has a Burger King advertising flyer, and then we see this sort of surreal landscape, this collision of rural, modern, and David was looking back at one of the first restaurants that we went to eat with my parents when we arrived in 1999 was Burger King. And in a way, it was really emotional because we were trying to automatically jump back into this sense that we've always been together, right? That there was nothing missing or no gap, that those few years that we hadn't seen them weren't there. And so I think this really marked the way that David was digesting this new world, this new emotional journey of reconnecting with our parents, rebuilding those relationships, but at the same time, holding this nostalgia, this melancholy to actually want to go back home, right? And so on the rest of this wall, Tiawetocha translates to let's go home. This is all family portraits that David constantly came back to during his all of this 10 years of work in here. And I think this speaks a lot about family values and community values, and how even though he was the first to enroll in a university in the US, we always perceive this as a collective sacrifice, as a collective experience, and acknowledging that thanks to my parents' sacrifice, he was able to pursue his artistic endeavors, right? And that really meant a lot for him and myself. And so I think these are gestures of love and reminders, right? That that this was more of a collective endeavor that he was developing in his work. This is a close-up of a couple images of my parents, the family in here. And I did want to point out a couple things about the image on the at the bottom here. These are my parents, and what we see here on the left is an air compressor, right? That's you'll see those in the wood shop or any construction project. And I think you will see that there's always a humorous component to David's work. There's always this kind of childhood spirit coming into his imagery. But I think at the same time, this air compressor stands there as a metaphor for the work ethic that we hold in the house, right? And how this translated into his studio, into his studies, into his other endeavors. This also is a metaphor for this constant endurance or subsisting as being growing up as a undocumented immigrant, and also building that resilience, right? I think a lot of these values at home led to this resilience or these mechanisms to be able to navigate through the many challenges that David would go on to face as an undocumented immigrant himself. This wall is titled Tiopancingo, which translates to sacred place for worship or place for praying. And I see this wall as a self-portrait of David. I really see a lot of this intuition and this, again, this childhood spirit coming back, and the way that he's maneuvering around with his materials and his imagery, and how he's really allowing that intuition of materiality to direct his works, right? And so you see some really more kind of irreverent approaches where the material itself carries a lot of weight about class. It carries a lot of weight about identity, narratives, and personal experiences. And we also see actually some references to spirituality and religion, and more of a critique that we're going to see here with some of these images. Let me go into this next close-up. So these aren't included in this exhibition, but I thought that these would actually be a part of that wall under Tiopancingo, and mainly because they carry this same really beautiful, intuitive approach to materiality. I think there's a lot of also irreverence, right? And a lot of sense of resistance, but also a very direct will to talk about class, right? And to talk about this through a migrant's experience. And I think this is really important because in the US, it's almost a taboo to talk about class. It's hard for Americans to talk about class, right? And how this really shapes our societal structures and how we navigate socially, right? And I think David really leaned into that, growing up lower class, growing up undocumented, and how that materiality that we grew up around with was definitely informing how he wanted to talk about that in his work, in his practice. And at the same time, this image on the right with the cardboard, that one is titled Petate, which is a rug made out of natural palm here in the region. And so this is a reference to also our origins and the indigenous roots. Petates are used, or were more used commonly, as actual beds. That's where you would sleep on a mat on the floor. If you go on a pilgrimage, that's what you would take to sleep on the road, to rest at the pilgrimage site. And so he's definitely thinking a lot about these parts of our cultural backgrounds that is informing also the way that he's thinking about materiality. You're going to see a lot of digital renderings that he was sketching and making at the same time as he was making physical paintings. And I think also these digital renderings go along with this wall where he has a series of 3 paintings that talk about religion and female experiences within this kind of perspective of religion, right? And I think, as you saw from some of the historical contextualization, religion is such an embedded force where we grew up in part of our culture. And I think at the same time, he's critiquing this imposed belief system and how this has really distorted the way that we have understood our cultural values and our ancestral values. And so throughout some of the other paintings, you will see that spirituality and religion comes back, and trying to reconstruct a notion of spirituality, trying to reconnect back to ancestral belief systems and values was definitely a key component of the way that he was trying to navigate that, right? It is important to note that Catholicism is such an embedded part of our daily life. As you saw from the Catholic Church built on top of the pyramid, the local myth here is that there are 365 Catholic churches in the city. That's not true. It's just a myth, but that says a lot, right? We have festivities, ceremonies almost every day of the year, and they're all connected to Catholicism, right? And so there is this weight, there is this force that really controls the everyday life, that really is incarnated into our values and culture, and it's woven or has imposed itself onto our traditions here in Mexico. Okipoloke Totlaniniwilis translates to they erased our memory. I also thought this was a really strong work in which David is really pointing to this transborderness of the manifest destiny idea, right? For us, what that means in Mexico is the Mexican Inquisition, when we saw religion be used as the reason to colonize and to brutally convert indigenous communities to Catholicism. And so I think there was a point where David was really kind of looking at both sides of the border, right? And what that colonization looked like and how that continues to impose itself on communities, and what this means for us as we try to look back at this history and traumas. The dog here again is referenced. Earlier, I was talking about the phenomena of aperramiento, where Spanish killed Mesoamerican priests. And so Also remembering and recognizing that dogs were used to hunt by the colonizers. Dogs were used to violently and brutally hunt indigenous communities, both in Mexico and in the US. And so there's a acknowledgement that there's a fragmentation and an intentional erasure of history happening on both sides of the border. Otech, Chihuaquilique, Matimicuanica translates to we were forced to self-displace. I think there's a lot of thematics here on this wall that point back to racism, nationalism, and again, David's thoughts and discourse and his practice was definitely pointing at the racism and discrimination not only happening on this side of on the US side of the border, but also how there is this long history and continues to be in Mexico a big problem for rural indigenous communities coping with racism, discrimination, and inevitably all of this leading to self-cultural genocides and internalizing racism. And what does this mean for a migrant indigenous who crosses the border, and not only is he or she an indigenous from Mexico, but is now all of a sudden an undocumented immigrant that has to face xenophobia from that side of the border. And so you'll see a lot of references here to that. You see some references to migration, and in a way David also was talking about in his personal statement how this sense of rootedness can be quite a tricky thing to navigate. Why? Because it can lead to a sense of nationalism, right? It can lead us to a sense of building xenophobia and otherness towards migrants and refugees. And so to me, it's been really interesting just to observe how racism has manifested itself on both sides of the border, right? I always look back at history, and the way that Spanish colonized Mexico was actually to build this national identity of mestizaje, right? It was actually a national movement by the Mexican government to celebrate the hybridity or mixed race as the national race. And as opposed to the US, where we saw actually the segregation, the separation of races as a way of colonization, right? And so it's really interesting. I think this all inevitably points back to the question of what's the right way of colonizing. Well, there should have never been a colonization of any sorts, right? But this kind of points back to that there's just no right way of colonizing, right? That inevitably it always ends up in a brutal genocides, culturally, socially, and politically. So Marcahuaca, Mamo, Tlalpasho, Toshik. We left our belly buttons, our navels buried in our birthland. This is a pretty strong tradition that we still have. There's a lot of value here in our hometown of burying our umbilical cord in our own land, and this could be in our backyard, this could be in our cornfields. This is still practiced, and our belief system is that wherever you bury your umbilical cord, that's where you're going to build a sense of rootedness that is home, that is where family and community is. And so for us, of course, this has deeply affected how we emotionally navigate being displaced from our own home, being forced to leave our own home, and having to reconstruct a new home and a new world in a new country. And so this to me made a lot of sense looking back at this work, where David was definitely very much in tune with this sense of holding on to our roots, looking back at our origins, and how do we continue a healthy connection to our community? How do we cope with our with being displaced from our homeland? There's a lot of imagery and ways that materials are really pushed under this scope of anthropological approaches, archaeological approaches, and that's something that a really beautiful quality that I've really enjoyed from looking at all of David's work. And you will see that even from the way that he's repurposing materials such as this old door, right? And sort of using that as a vehicle to talk about memory and to talk about this anthropological approaches to carving out our own history, healing that history, telling that history more accurately, and also at the same time talking about current experiences of being a migrant. And so you will notice there's these subtle ways that he's kind of mocking or he's talking about rootedness and how that could lead to nationalism and racism. And you will often see the American flag planted in his environments. And to me, that's a very peculiar way to talk about or criticize this idea of assimilation, right, or homogenization. These are one of my favorite works that David did, and this is not in the exhibition, but I really wanted to share this work because, again, it points back to this this really beautiful empowerment of anthropological tools and ways of thinking to be able to look back at this history and how do we reconstruct that? How do we look back at that and literally uncarve or dig out this buried history that we continue to live with here in Mexico. This is a close-up of that same installation. Tlaxtlahuillo translates to retributions. I think inevitably all of this, of course, leads back to the way that David is talking about resilience. David was also talking about, well, who is accountable for these forced displacements? And at the same time, talking about this sense of mobility, migration. This image on the top, to me, is a really powerful image that tries to depict real-time migration. And in its title, The Other Conquest, right? And so I think, in a way, David was talking about this mass migration up north as a way of reclaiming land, as a way of building agency within this larger community, and having a sense of belonging, building a sense of belonging, and building a dignified life as a migrant in the US, right? And again, we see this really playful approach to David's work with the painting here at the bottom, where he's referencing American popular culture to talk about this sense of belonging, assimilation, in a way he's kind of mocking assimilation, and really kind of trying to distort that or disrupt this idea of assimilation. This is also not in the exhibition, but also a really powerful painting. Here is Pancho Villa depicted in this painting, and the title of the painting is Pancho Villa with no visa. Pancho Villa was actually the first terrorist, as the US would later call him, to invade the US on their own land in the Southwest. He was able to get away with invading part of the US. And so a lot of the terminology of terrorism and a lot of this migration security that the US started taking more seriously was because of Pancho Villa. And so David is really looking back at this part of history and celebrating, in a way, acknowledging, right, these and mocking the borders at the same time. And so you'll see the American flag here again in this painting as a way to kind of mock this border, this sense of assimilation again. Ninimetlen ashtopa wantlen okpanos. This wall is very interesting, and the way that David actually comes back and asserts the way that he's talking about contemporary issues and painting. He's really talking about the form, right, itself, and he's really interested in texture, color, shapes, as a way to to bring himself into the discourse from his own experiences. And so what's to happen is he brings a lot of these indigenous shapes and references and symbols into these abstract minimalist paintings. And what you will see reoccurring back into these paintings is these shapes that look like little mountains. For example, the painting here on the far left has this kind of brown mountain, right? Well, that was this kind of shape was used a lot in Mesoamerican imagery and codex to reference places, to reference communities, to reference, of course, mountains and hills. And David was reaching back at that imagery and bringing that back into this into these paintings and the way that he's exploring contemporary issues of painting. And I really admire that, the way that he's kind of, in a way, decolonizing contemporary issues of painting by bringing his own kind of experience and heritage into these works. There's also this sense of irreverence, again, with these paintings that I really admire, and that is also this sense of agency to approach a lot of these works with intuition, right? And to be using the textural qualities of these as a sense of irreverence also. These are more images of how he's combining these approaches. I think these are a lot more kind of, they're more clear on how he's building this hybridity of contemporary painting approaches, and then also bringing in indigeneity and some of those image references back into these works. So these are also digital renderings, collages that he was developing. There's so many of these, but I thought these were really interesting. The one on the left is actually this character, this figure that is referencing coyotes, or the people that actually are in charge of smuggling migrants across the border, right? And he's kind of really looking back at that and building this almost Mesoamerican imagery to that, but talking again about contemporary urgencies of migration. More examples of how he was maneuvering around and developing more of these works. And so a lot of these actually would start out digitally, and then he would take these onto canvas and reproduce some of these physically. And so there's a lot of these that were digitally produced that were never translated onto canvas. Also, one of my, this is a really exciting wall, one of my favorite walls. We see David really embracing this childhood spirit. We see him really coming in, and in a way, we see glimpses of that nostalgia, this longing for the past, longing for that childhood that he left behind in 1999. And in a way, he's celebrating that childhood that he's holding close to his heart, right? And that's something that, to me, talks about healing, right? The title of this wall, to me, made sense on how he was really looking at healing processes by celebrating and looking back at that childhood spirit that he maintained throughout his practice. Again, there's these humorous components, there's these references to popular culture, there's these references that allow him to revisit those memories as a kid, going through that migration experience. The paintings on the left are actually a reference to rótulos in Mexico. Rótulos are paintings for businesses, for small businesses outside their walls. And these are or what some consider outsider artists, right? And David was really kind of taking that as a big reference to the way that we build visual culture, the way that we also build resiliency as creative, through creative expression, and in a way celebrating that part of our visual culture and kind of uplifting that in his own work. Here's another digital collage, again, like a really playful approach, making some references to popular culture that he grew up in, both in Mexico and in the US. The last wall in the show is Yectlaliyani, reparations. A lot of these are different kinds of studies, different sketches, different works on paper that some of them would actually lead into larger works or a series of a body of works. A lot of them carry this, again, this playfulness, this humorous component to them. And then a lot of these were then developed more into his other paintings. So I just wanted to share a couple real quick. This one, of course, he's thinking a lot about colonization and the debris of colonization that has shaped our state and our city. There's a lot of French influence here in Puebla. And I think he's definitely acknowledging all of this, how messy this is, how hard it is to untangle, how blurry it can be at times, right? To see this history that is so kind of hidden and so erased. And so to me, this is a really powerful kind of study and looking back at that. This is the last image that I wanted to share with you all from one of David's sketchbooks. One of my favorite drawings, and the way that he's he's talking about temporality of indigenous migration. He's really talking about the past, present, and future at the same time, in the same way that I'm interested in that in my own work. And I love how in this image, he's really colliding those temporalities. He's addressing popular culture. He's also talking about or referencing these Mesoamerican imagery stylization to this rendering here. He's talking about mobility, migration, arriving, talking about community. And I think in a way, this encapsulates or really frames how he was trying to talk about those experiences in his own work. Thank you all. That was the last image. I think, Heidi, we might have time for some questions, maybe?
Yes, so you are free to put any questions or comments in the chat window, or you can unmute yourself. So keep an eye on the chat for a minute.
Okay.
Federico, one thing I was curious about, you and David went to graduate school around the same time, is that correct?
Yeah, we actually started the very same year and finished the very same semester, yeah.
Okay, I was just curious, did you keep up kind of a dialogue during that time since you were both in graduate, like very different graduate programs? I think David went for painting, you were going for digital arts.
Almost every day we would have conversations. Yeah, so in a way, it was difficult, but it was also organic to embody his work, to think about the way that he was developing that.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like for both of you, there's a kind of community consciousness that's been really important and motivating in terms of how your careers move forward.
Yeah, and I think it was gonna shift more for him because when we came back to visit in Mexico and launched the artist residency, he didn't do any painting. All he did was community work, and he was really embracing that and recognizing the urgency of social practice also.
Uh-huh.
I want to give a shout out to my sister who's here, and I see some friends also. Anybody else have questions, comments?
Okay.
Hi, I could ask a question.
Please.
Thank you, if that's okay. I'm Kristen. Yeah, and thank you so much, Federico. That was a lovely talk, and I was really moved during the exhibition itself. I just thought it was really a wonderful portrait of your brother and his practice. But one of the things that stood out to me was a kind of a playful, I felt like there's like a lot of playful joking, play and joking, especially one of the last images with the Power Rangers. There's some irony in there. And I guess I was kind of connecting that back to this sort of, since what you said, his like childlike spirit, his like positive spirit. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, or his interest in humor, if that was something that came up in your conversations.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, thank you, Kristen, for that question. I would say it's even a larger part of our Mexican culture also, this sense of, for us, this idea of bullying is more of a distorted notion. It's more of a spectrum, if you will. And so to be able to joke with someone, you create brotherhood or sisterhood, right? You create community, you create trust. There's a lot of kind of cultural coding within that too. And So, he was seeing that, he was celebrating that, and he was embracing that as part of his practice. And I think it allowed him in a way to talk about these other pressing issues such as assimilation, xenophobia, racism, etc., in a way that that was not so direct, but in a way that allowed for him to build these landscapes and these kind of more of a spectrum to his work, right? Yeah, so I think he was definitely using it as a tool.
Great, thank you so much.
And Federico, there's a few questions and comments in the chat, which, can you see that?
I do. I see Joan. Yeah, thank you for that. And then I see Noah. I don't know what the first question may be referring to. Do you want to jump on, Joan? Yeah.
Hey, I don't know if you're listening. You made a comment about an effort you had going on down in Mexico with your brother, where he wasn't painting, but he was involved in the community more. And I wanted to know like what the name of that effort was, just for my own research and just education. I'm a new student here in the art school, so I'm learning all I can.
Got it. Yeah. Okay, I get it. Yeah, thank you. That is the Rascuache Artist Residency that we launched in 2016, where we invite artists to from all sorts of disciplines to come and engage in social practice and community work.
Okay, and I just typed that into the chat so you can see how it's spelled. Look it up.
Okay, I think I see. Yeah, thank you all for these comments. I see a question from Haley. Yes. Did the use of found and recycled materials ever call back to the environment and the encroachment on the land belonging to natives? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you notice from the way that he builds space, dimensionality, and landscape, he's really colliding these different worlds, right? And how one affects the other. And for us in our rural hometown here, we get aggressively impacted by the cities nearby, by that kind of more modern lifestyle, if you will, right? All of those plastics and all of those other issues kind of imposing themselves on us as well. And so the way he was also thinking about landscape and material was class, right? And there's this spirituality of rascuachismo happening. For those of you not aware, rascuachismo was a movement in the 1960s in California that really embraced the spirit of inventiveness and making the most from the least and repurposing material and a way of thinking, a lifestyle, a celebratory way of resilience within our communities. And so that's definitely what David was also embracing in his materiality. Other questions?
Something I was curious about was the curation of the show. So I know that you had worked with a plan and you were kind of sketching the layout in relation to the gallery, but did the thematic walls, was that something that you kind of formed while you were in the space, or did you kind of come with the notion that these paintings were going to be in those groups?
Yeah, both. Yeah, there, in a way, I was trying to build this conversation with the work and also with David through his work. And I noticed there being threads, right? There being commonalities with the work as I was looking at the curatorial part of it. But then once we were in the space, there was a lot of room for embracing how the works were in conversation with one another, how the space was also shaping these conversations. And yeah, I almost feel like each thematic, each wall carries almost like a spirit also, right? And allowing that spirit to kind of flow throughout the works. I see another question here by Morris. Could you speak to the importance of language in his work, specifically with regard to exhibiting in the US? Yeah, I think this may be referencing to some of the text that David would write directly onto the paintings, phrases, words. There's a lot of course, a lot of words and phrases that reference colonization and that history. And I think David was definitely talking to Americans or that side of the border, right? Because most of the text is in English, right? And the way he wanted to have that dialogue, that conversation, because we already know what we're going through as migrants, right, in our community. And so I think there was this urgency for him to really make sure that not only were you experiencing the works, but you were understanding also what he was trying to say, right? Morris, I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. Okay, well, for everybody, oh, something else just popped up.
Hey.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Jacinda Russell, yeah. Thanks for being here too. I wanted to share more images actually from the way that David displayed his work, which is even more playful than the way I curated. And it's even more intuitive because he was using a lot of objects and he was doing a lot of more kind of extended sculptural approaches to his work. And he was using everyday kind of found materials as part of his installations. And so I was in a way trying to navigate that, right? And trying to channel in how he would respond to the space and allowing for those moments. Yeah, that was a very intuitive moment. Heidi was there when we put that small graphite rendering right on top of that crack and on the wall. And then to me, it was just like, yeah, I think that's definitely what David would do with the space. There's another work, the very last piece that we hung was this purple cutout shape that is actually very high up on the, maybe most people miss it, right? But it has that kind of playfulness, that kind of disruptive component to it in the space. So yeah, there's some parts in the exhibition that try to channel in David's installation instincts.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Jacinda, because there was a lot of conversation about that when the show was going up, both of those pieces.
It was just, I think, the most perfect moment for me, and I took a little photo of it so I could remember it. But thank you so much, Federico.
Thank you.
Okay, so Pata Rajada is up until 4 o'clock on Friday, February 4th. So there's still over another week to see the show and spend time with this work. And I think, although it would have been lovely to hear this talk in the gallery, we got to see some additional images and kind of had an additional historical context to the work too. So thank you so much, Federico, for talking to us today and sharing your thoughts about this exhibition and for bringing the exhibition to Ball State.
All right. Yeah, thank you all. Thank you again, Heidi, for all the incredible help, support, and love that you also put into this exhibition. My wife, Karina, is also on here who helped with the installation. And I think there's just been a lot of love, of course, that has been poured into this. And I think, yeah, I think the most important thing for the work is to be shared, right? For these conversations to be alive and to keep with our surrounding community. So yeah, I hope you all continue to get more from the exhibition. Thank you again for being here. It's a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.